Tyranny and Sexual Abuse in the Catholic Church, a Jesuit Tragedy, Dr. John R. T. Lamont. In the light of new revelations about sexual abuse in the Church, many Catholics are asking how the situation that these revelations have disclosed can possibly have come about. The first question that occurs, a question of long standing, is, why did bishops deal with sexual abusers by concealing their offences and moving them to new assignments, rather than by removing them from ministry? No sufficient answer has yet been given to this question. It has now been made more pointed by a further question. How did Theodore McCarrick get appointed as Archbishop of Washington and Cardinal, and even become a principal drafter of the American Bishops' Policy on Sexual Abuse in 2002, when his own involvement in sexual abuse was widely known in clerical circles and had been made known to the Holy See? These things did not happen because of the law of the Church. Until November 27, 1983, the law in force in the Latin Church was the 1917 Code of Canon Law. Canon 2359, paragraph 2 of this code, decreed that if clerics commit an offence against the sixth commandment of the Decalogue with minors under 16 years of age, they are to be suspended, declared infamous, deprived of every office, benefice, dignity, or position that they may hold, and in the most grievous cases, deposed. This canon was replaced by Canon 1395, paragraph 2 in the 1983 Code, which states that a cleric who in any other way has committed an offence against the sixth commandment of the Decalogue, with a minor below the age of 16 years, is to be punished with just penalties, not excluding dismissal from the clerical state if the case so warrants. The 1983 Code addressed offences of the kind committed by Cardinal McCarrick with Canon 1395, paragraph 2, which states that a cleric who in another way has committed an offence against the sixth commandment of the Decalogue, if the delict was committed by force or threats, or publicly, or with a minor below the age of 16 years, is to be punished with just penalties, not excluding dismissal from the clerical state, if the case so warrants. These canons do not present these punishments as options. They require that such offences be punished by ecclesiastical authority. So our question now becomes, why did ecclesiastical authorities break the law by not enforcing these canons? No doubt a number of factors combined to produce this disastrous situation. There is one factor, however, that has not been widely discussed or understood, but that has had an effect that is second to none in giving rise to the scandalous situation that now engrosses our attention. This is the influence within the Church of a conception of authority as a form of tyranny, rather than as being based on and constituted by law. This essay will present the nature of this conception, describe how it came to be influential, and explore some of its more significant results. The intellectual origins of this conception of authority and obedience are largely to be found in nominalist theology and philosophy. William of Ockham notoriously came down on one side of the Euthyphro dilemma by asserting that good actions are good simply because they are commanded by God, and that God could make idolatry, murder, and sodomy good, and abstention from these actions evil, if he commanded that they be performed. This conception of divine authority lends support to a tyrannical understanding of authority in general, as based on the arbitrary will of the possessor of power, rather than on law. A law-based understanding of authority, in contrast, holds that law derived from the nature of the good provides the source of the authority of a ruler, and delimits the sphere in which a ruler can give commands. Scholars have long known that the dominance of nominalist thought in the 14th century left its mark on Catholic thought for centuries, with key nominalist theses remaining entrenched even in scholars who believed themselves to be upholding anti-nominalist traditions. The nature of authority was one of these theses. Catholic theologians and philosophers during the Counter-Reformation all held that law and moral obligation are to be understood as resulting from the command of a superior. Suarez gave a characteristic description of law as the act whereby a superior wills to bind an inferior to the performance of a particular deed. Restoration of discipline among clergy and religious was one of the main goals of the Counter-Reformation. The theories of law and authority that guided this restoration differed from a pure nominalist position, but these differences were lost when the practical principles for training in obedience were devised. These principles embodied a tyrannical understanding of authority and a servile understanding of rightful obedience as consisting in total submission to the will of the superior. The most influential formulation of these principles was given in the writings of St. Ignatius Loyola on obedience. The key elements of the Ignatian notion of authority are the following. The mere execution of the order of a superior is the lowest degree of obedience, and does not merit the name of obedience or constitute an exercise of the virtue of obedience. In order to merit the name of virtue, an exercise of obedience should attain the second level of obedience, which consists in not only doing what the superior orders, but conforming one's will to that of the superior, so that one not only will to obey an order, but wills that that particular order should have been given, simply because the superior willed it. The third and highest degree of obedience consists in conforming not only one's will, but one's intellect to the order of the superior, so that one not only wills that an order should have been given, but actually believes that the order was the right order to give, simply because the superior gave it. He who aims at making an entire and perfect oblation of himself, in addition to his will, must offer his understanding, which is a further and the highest degree of obedience. He must not only will, but he must think the same as the superior, submitting his own judgment to that of the superior, so far as a devout will can bend the understanding. In the highest and most meritorious degree of obedience, the follower has no more will of his own in obeying than an inanimate object. Every one of those who live under obedience ought to allow himself to be carried and directed by divine providence through the agency of the superior, as if he were a lifeless body which allows itself to be carried to any place and to be treated in any manner desired, or as if he were an old man's staff which serves in any place and in any manner whatsoever in which the holder wishes to use it. The sacrifice of will and intellect involved in this form of obedience is the highest form of sacrifice possible, because it offers to God the highest human faculties, viz. The intellect and the will. It should be said that St. Ignatius's practical exercise of authority did not agree with his own writings. He was accustomed to send Jesuits on independent missions where they had to use their initiative. Literally construed, his writings on obedience could have no application in these situations, because the superior was not there to give the commands to which this kind of obedience is due. We can explain the contradiction between his theory and his practice by the influence of the accepted philosophical and theological ideas of his time, and by the goals that his teachings on obedience were aimed at. His doctrine on obedience was intended to provide for an initial training in discipline, of the kind practiced in the military profession that he had once followed. Once this training was completed, it was also intended to ensure that Jesuits on independent missions internalized the objective that their superiors had sent them to accomplish, so that they would correctly and wholeheartedly carry out the missions they had been given. But St. Ignatius did not intend to give religious superiors a totalitarian control over all the thoughts and actions of their subordinates. Unfortunately, the interpreters of his works read his writings literally and credited him with upholding a totalitarian control of this kind as the model of religious authority. Some expositions of his teaching described obedience to an order than one suspects, but is not certain to be immoral, as an especially high and praiseworthy form of obedience. This statement about the exceptional merit of obeying orders that are morally dubious is made in St. Ignatius's letter 150. The letter was in fact written for him by Factor Polanco, his secretary, but since it went out under St. Ignatius's signature, it benefited from his authority. The full development of a tyrannical conception of religious authority and a servile conception of obedience can be found in Alphonsus Rodriguez S.J.'s Practice of Perfection and Christian Virtues. This work, the most widely read manual of ascetic theology of the Counter-Reformation, was published in 1609. It was required reading for Jesuit novices up to the Second Vatican Council. Its contents were accepted as the correct interpretation of St. Ignatius's teaching on obedience. In his proposed examination of conscience, Fonte Rodriguez, who is not to be confused with St. Alphonsus Rodriguez, requires the penitent 2. To obey in will and heart, having one and the same wish and will as the superior. 3. To obey also with the understanding and judgment, adopting the same view and sentiment as the superior, not giving place to any judgments or reasonings to the contrary. Ifi. To take the voice of the superior as the voice of God, and obey the superior, whoever he may be, as Christ our Lord, and the same for subordinate officials. V. To follow blind obedience, that is obedience without inquiry or examination, or any seeking of reasons for the why and wherefore, it being reason enough for me that it is obedience and the command of the superior. Rodriguez praises obedience, as he understands it, in illuminating terms. One of the greatest comforts and consolations that we have in religion is this, that we are safe in doing what obedience commands. The superior, it is that may be wrong in commanding this or that, but you are certain that you are not wrong in doing what is commanded, for the only account that God will ask of you is if you have done what they commanded you, and with that your account will be sufficiently discharged before God. It is not for you to render account whether the thing commanded was a good thing, or whether something else would not have been better. That does not belong to you, but to the account of the superior. When you act under obedience, God takes it off your books and puts it on the books of the superior. Like other writers, Rodriguez makes the usual exception for obedience to commands that are manifestly contrary to the divine law. It has, however, been noted that the Jesuit doctrine of probabilism tends to nullify this exception. According to this doctrine, there is no sin in doing any action that a reputable authority maintains to be permissible, and one's religious superior normally counts as a reputable authority. There is also a psychological fact that tends to make this exception nugatory. Internalizing and practicing this notion of obedience is difficult and requires time, motivation, and effort. When it has been done successfully, it has a lasting effect. Once one has destroyed one's capacity to criticize the actions of one's superiors, one cannot revive this capacity and its exercise at will. Following the directive to refuse obedience to one's superiors when their commands are manifestly sinful then becomes psychologically difficult or even impossible, except perhaps in the most extreme cases, such as commands to murder someone, which are not the sort of sinful commands that religious superiors often have an interest in giving in any case. This conception of obedience did not remain a peculiarity of the Society of Jesus, but came to be adopted by the Counter-Reformation Church as a whole. It became prevalent in the new institution of the Counter-Reformation Seminary. The treatise on obedience of the Sulpician Louis Tronson gave St. Ignatius's teaching and writings as the summit of Catholic teaching on obedience. The Sulpician adoption of this conception was particularly important because of their central role in the training of priests in seminaries from the 17th century onwards. The servile conception of obedience remained the standard one into the 20th century. Adolphe Tanqueray, in his widely read and translated, and in many ways excellent, work Précis de théologie ascétique et mystique, could write that perfect souls who have reached the highest degree of obedience submit their judgment to that of their superior, without even examining the reasons for which he commands them. The Jesuit approach to the manifestation of conscience contributed to inculcating a totalitarian understanding of authority. St. Ignatius not only encouraged but required the manifestation of conscience, and he required that the manifestation be made to the religious superior. The manifestation of conscience included the dispositions and desires for the performance of good, the obstacles and difficulties encountered, the passions and temptation which move or harass